Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, as a few of you all start streaming in. Thank you for joining us again. It's a pleasure that I welcome you all back for our final show of 2021 of Chewing the Accounting Fad. It's hard to believe that, as ridiculous as it sounds, I don't know what the date is today, November 18. We're 5 weeks away from Christmas and it is our final show. Huge welcome to Jason Cunningham. Jace, how are you?
Yeah, going well, Janso. Yourself, pal?
Very good, mate. Very good. It's hard to believe we are where we are in the calendar year at the moment. And I think, this is what's exciting as well, because we're going to leverage a little bit off what we did in our October show for today's show. So there's a lot of excitement, and I know we've had some fantastic feedback as well. So I'm looking forward to sharing all of that with all the people that are joining us. And obviously with our panelists, which we'll introduce to the people that don't know much about them very shortly.
No, you're right, PJ. Last month's show was a great show. It was a cracking show, and it was good to get, as we said off air, and that's not really a good phrase to use, sharing with the audience things that we said off air. Obviously, we spoke about some of your innate problems that you've got in your life, but we also spoke about the fact that we gleaned some pretty topical information from some of the doyens of the industry. And yeah, I guess today, if I've read the tea leaves right, considering I'm being put on the bench, which is another conversation altogether, but if I read the tea leaves right, today's about, putting together the practicality of what we've learned and how we take all these great pearls of wisdom and how we put them into practice. Is that the tack that we're taking, old boy?
100%. And I suppose, look, that all came about because we ran some really good feedback following the last show. I think the show could have gone for probably 2 hours, to be fair, and we sort of had to cut it off after 60 minutes. And because of that, I threw out the feedback to everybody. I did a poll. So the feedback from the poll was also evident that some of the key issues that were surrounding this mastering advisory side was the ability to display value to the client. And I think 75% of the feedback we had on the polls we conducted was close to compliance work. And I think this got mentioned in our last show. Compliance work's easy to price. We know what a self-managed super fund or a family trust or a company or an individual, we're pretty easy at determining the cost of that and how to price that with an engagement letter. But how do you display the value? How do you price the service? And how do you ideally, and again, this got brought up and we're going to run through a little bit of that today, how do you not sell the service? So these are the critical things that we spoke about last month. So let's welcome back our panel first of all. So for those of you that joined us last month, you'll know that Jace actually put some nicknames to a few people as well. I think Warwick missed out on a nickname, so we'll probably work on that today, Warwick. Yeah. Let's welcome back Glen Frost. So Frosty, welcome back.
Thank you, Paul.
Eddie Senatore, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
And Warwick Cavell, welcome back.
Thanks, Paul.
How are we all?
Yeah, very well.
That's good. Now, the challenge to Jason, I've thrown out a challenge to Jason today as well. So this is another little bit of to everybody that's out there as well. So we've got a challenge for Jason. I don't know how he's going to go with this, and you'll probably share with me pretty shortly how you feel about it anyway, Jason. And that is, I've asked Jason to probably sit back a little bit and look at it take what he's hearing and what he's going to do next. So more from a practical point of view, he's part of a 5-partner firm, 5 directors out of the practice, 55 team members. So I know the practice do this advisory role quite well, but at the same time, the idea is, like you mentioned before, using your phrase of the doyens. So looking at what Frosty, Ted and Warwick can actually share, and then what you're hearing and what you're going to do next. Yeah. So how are you going to go with it?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt it's going to be a struggle because, where there's a void, my voice tends to fill it, as we've spoken a couple of times. So I'm just going to correct you. We were at 55 team members. Now we're at 54 because Frosty's pinched one of them. So thanks for that. Appreciate that, Frosty. It's great to work with you last month. And now PwC have come in and swept in and taken one of our team members. So that's good of you. I appreciate it. And just write that.
Happy to help manage your costs, Jason.
One of the wonderful things was that we went through a recruiter, 15% of their income. She stayed with us for 6 or 7 months, and then PwC comes knocking and off she goes. So appreciate that. Yeah, anything I can do to help you with your labour shortage, just just send a direct email to me. You know,
it's all just about articulation of value, Jason.
So this is a good thing because we're going to go into that. So we're going to talk about value.
Just in whose world is this a good thing? Just help me understand that. Not mine, Frosty's.
Very, very good. Very funny.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into this because, again, we've got a lot of information to share. It's on the back of obviously some great feedback. That feedback straight after the show, I think, a lot of people were actually really complimentary of all you three guys, hence why we've asked all three experts to come back for the panel for the November show, our last show for 2021. So, look, let's get into this. We're going to talk about displaying value. We're going to talk about pricing. We're going to talk about getting to the mindset of not selling the service. So, Warwick, I'm going to kick off with you, mate, because you were very strong with your thoughts, opinions, and, again, really passionate, probably that's the great word, about how you go about this. And you've got some great thoughts. I've known you for a very long time about this particular subject. But what I would like to do is kick off with, following last month's show, let's call it the reflection piece. And what do you see as being a key message that you want to get across today with the topic of mastering advisory, displaying value?
Well, I guess the one point that I'd really like to make is that there's two ways to approach this. In simple terms, that you can either start with a service or you can start with the client. If you start with a service, then you're saying build it and they'll come. High risk strategy, right? Works well in the movies, doesn't work so well in real life. So you sort of say, I've got a product. What services should I be offering? Should I be building a business advisory services division? And I'd suggest that's not the place to start. The way you answer those questions is you start with the client and you have the conversation. What does the client actually need? Getting back to Eddie's point, helping the client move from point A to B. The starting point is always the client. Find out what the client needs, and you often find that you've already got the service offering, just needs to be utilised in a certain way. There's no need to start with the service. You start with the service, you're going to have to flog something. You say, I've got this service, I've got this business health check that I've now invested in, I've developed this wonderful business health check, now I've got to try and sell it to the client. Wouldn't it be better to actually ask the client what they need, what they want, and then work out and solve their problem? So to me, there are fundamentally two different ways to do that. It's a bit like the difference between what's a value proposition. A value proposition is not what you can do for the client. It's a proposition to which the client will want to say yes. Now, subtle, but really important. If you see it as what you can do for the client, where do you start? You start with, what's my offering? You're already in sales mode. If you start with what's the proposition to which the client will want to say yes, where do you have to start? You have to start with the client conversation and find out what the client wants to say yes to. So to me, there are just fundamental ways of doing that, and asking about, should we have a business advisory services division? I'd say, oh yeah, wholeheartedly. That's exactly what the accounting profession needs now, is another silo, exactly what we need. Right? It's, you would only tell me what value it adds to the client. Why are we even having that discussion on whether it should be a separate division or not? What interest does the client possibly have, and how does that benefit the client? So why are we even discussing that issue? So it's the wrong starting point for me. So long-winded answer. Yeah. Pardon?
And is that why you believe it's a high risk strategy? Is what you said?
Absolutely.
So does that you feel that takes you down the road where you need to sell it then?
Yeah, exactly. Because I've got a product now. I want to sell this mug to my clients as a business health check or whatever. I've invested the time and developed it. I've now got to sell it. Even if the client doesn't want it, I've got to sell it. And that's what a lot of accounting practices are actually doing at the moment, because of it works different in compliance than it does in business advisory services. If you're talking about, we've got a trust offering, or a self-managed super fund offering, or whatever it is, that is required by legislation. There are certain things that are required. So it's not difficult in that sense to be able to do that. But in business advisory services, it's a completely different scenario. And starting with the product to me, is not the way to go.
Interesting. Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with everything Warwick said. And there's, the danger with having a product is that you try and fit it into, around a square peg into a round hole, and you end up, banging your head against the wall. Having said that, I think it's also important that we sort of highlight the different types of advisory. Advisory is such a broad concept. And so I sort of look at it as business advisory, tax advisory, and also I do a lot of family advisory. And I think there is a slightly different approach to each of those, depending on, how well you know your client and what it is that you're talking to them about. I think a lot of what we're selling is our experience. And that comes back to what Warwick's saying, is that if you're listening to what they need or what they're expressing, what they actually want a lot of the times is your experience. The thing I get asked a lot, particularly in family advisory, what do other families like ours do?
Yeah.
What do, and that's really what they're valuing, is, can you share some insights with me as to what's worked with others? And I'm not trying to push that solution on them. I'm just sharing that I've seen this work in the past. How about you adopt this approach? And that's really that's my product, I guess, in that my product is experience. And if I don't know the answer, I will try and find someone who does know the answer for you.
Frosty, excuse my ignorance, what's family advisory?
I do a lot of succession planning work. So
Yeah.
I'm working with families around transitioning businesses through the generations, or trade sales, or, I'm actually sitting in a client's office now, helping them with effectively a management buyout, where part of the family are buying into the business and management are buying into the business. Mm. And a lot of that is sharing, what have I seen other families do when they're looking at this? How do they, do they bring in-laws in or not? Well, a whole bunch of things that are just experience and insight based. So it's not a product, but there's product elements to it.
Yeah. So things like maybe shareholders agreement with divorce clauses in it and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, but before you get to that, it's just helping them through what is it that they actually want. And so in 10 years' time, where do they want to get to? And then working through that process, so they've got a pretty strong foundation, and then moving on to the shareholders agreement. Funnily enough, this morning's discussion was about the shareholders agreement. We're about 6 months in now, so that's about the right time to be starting to do that, because there were a lot of family issues before we got to that point.
But the important point there, Glenn, is that you haven't invested time into creating this product. You've picked up the experience over the years, and you've drawn on that experience. So you haven't got a vested interest in trying to flog a particular solution.
I don't. Yeah, I don't. But I do. And again, it comes down to how you define product, in that I don't see product as a dirty word as such, in that I do almost badge my succession planning work as a bit of a product, in that I try and give it a framework so that when I'm talking about it, I can articulate to a client, what is it that we're going to do, and what do I think they will get out of it, so that when they're thinking of buying, they have a bit more tangibility. The danger, which you're highlighting, is that if I focus too much on the product, I then go and, sell that product when they don't need it. And if they don't need it, they're not buying it. So I'm wasting my time.
And what you're missing out on is the benefit that product produces. You're starting from the benefit that the client wants, and then fitting the product, or it's really a label rather than the product, because the client's got to get their head around it. So, so you give it a label like succession planning or whatever it is. It's not a product that you've built this thing like this mug that I've got here that I now need to flog. What you're actually doing is you're starting with and being clear on the benefit the client wants, and then saying, well, this is your solution, which is the succession planning that's been built over years of your experience. And that, to me, so I don't think product's a dirty word, but bear in mind where you start impacts the process. So if you start with the product, then your goal unconsciously becomes to sell that product. And
Yeah.
I don't think it's professional. You know, we're in the relationship business. So to me, it shouldn't be starting there. It should be starting with the person. And I think, you know, you've explained it beautifully, Glenn. To me, 90% of what the accountant needs is already in their experiential background. They've just got to listen to the client and repackage that in the conversation so that, okay, that's what you need. So your shareholders agreements and stuff like that, that's been built up over years of experience. It hasn't been just rolled out for this particular client, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's right. And the other key point there is, you know, I do like the word label from the context of when I talk about succession planning with a client, they don't know what I mean, you know, so they've no idea what the process is. So my label, I then sort of unpack that label and describe to them the journey, what succession planning looks like over a 6-month period and how we're going to go about it, and I try and make it a little bit more tangible. Because if I'm talking advisory, what does that mean? Like I don't understand, you know, and I don't understand, therefore I'm not buying, therefore you end up this sort of loop where you never sell anything because you don't actually have a clear way of describing what they're going to get.
PJ, it sounds to me, PJ, but listening to Frosty and Cavell Avenue, that they're both sort of saying the very similar thing, right? And what I've heard, and to pinch a phrase from the financial services or financial planning industry, it's really around becoming that trusted advisor, right? So it's about developing the relationship and listening to the customer and saying, okay, right, in this circumstance, based on my experience, my opinion is this. And therefore, it's so you become that first port of call when anything, and it's not just financial, but in Frosty's case, it's a bit of family succession planning, and it's and how we deal with the in-laws or the outlaws or however we want to refer to them as. And so really, it's listening, and it's developing that sense of trust so that the customer, the client, knows that you're that right person for them. Is that what I've heard?
Yeah, I'm probably saying, Jason, that to me, the client is not interested in our services. Nobody wants to buy our services. The client starts with, I've got a problem with my auntie or my uncle or my... that's what they want. Now, our service may solve that. To me, they're purely and simply focused on, we've got conflict in our family.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't care what you call it. Can you fix it?
Yeah.
Right? And so you can, if you walk in with a business health check, you need this, you need that.
Yeah, blah, blah, blah.
They say, why? Well, what do I need that for? How does that connect with my family dispute? So we've started at the wrong end. Listen to the family dispute. What's happening in the family? When did it start happening? Why do you think it start happening? And then with them, what do you think would work? And then you start to introduce what Glenn started to talk about. Well, in our experience, we've found that when families have had this situation, we've found that getting the family together in a forum is a good thing to do. Now, it doesn't look like a product or a service now. It looks like it's very much connected to the benefit that the client wanted in the first place. Does that make sense? Yeah,
no, it does. And notwithstanding, Frosty might have that checklist and all that sort of stuff in the back end as to how they follow due process at the juggernaut that is PwC, that runs around pinching employees from small, humble firms in Parkville.
That's part of the checklist, Jason.
And that's really important in terms of just the two things that I heard then. So, we're trying to make this as practical as possible. The two things that I heard then, and I know being around enough firms for as long as I have as well, a lot of them often say, well, we've tried it and it's failed. We've tried it and it's failed. We haven't been able to get it successful, whatever successful is to each firm. Now, what I'm hearing is there's two key things, and just to confirm this. One is, and over the last 25 years, there has been a lot of, let's call it product. You're leading with a product. It is a tech-based fill in the survey, or here's a link to go and do a health check. And what I'm hearing is, if you've tried that in the past, try something different, because it may not have worked in the past, because you're leading with a product, which and there's a question there as well that I'm going to get to in a second, but that's not helping the client. That means you're not understanding. I'm going to go to Glenn. He had made a really, really important point last month as well that we're going to get to as well. The second point there is language. It's important not to use our language because they don't understand what that language is. If you go in with succession plan, well, they're going to say, what the is a succession plan?
Yeah.
You know, you've got to use language that they're going to understand. And I think that's something, again, that using the experience of everyone that's listening, as well as you guys here, is about making sure that you can articulate what it's going to mean to them, dumb it down. The old KISS theory, keep it simple, stupid, try as possible. That's what I'm hearing. Is that fair to say, guys?
Yes, yeah. And just on that, like succession planning, I banged my head against the wall for a long time talking about succession planning, and then worked out that no one knew what I was talking about. I now just describe it as the transition of management and ownership over time. And if you sort of, again, using that KISS principle of just breaking it down to, you know, it is management and ownership as separate, and it happens over time, and it's a transition, that tends to get people nodding more than succession planning, because they think that sort of is somehow estate planning or death or something, you know. So yeah, keeping it as simple as possible.
Yeah, I agree, Glenn. There's a good question in the chat too, Paul, if you want to refer to that.
Go for it.
You know, what if the client doesn't know what they need? And the answer is, in most situations, they probably don't. But they do feel the impact of something that's not working. So what your questions or conversation is, you know, if I sat here and said to you, Paul, how's business going? You say, oh, not so good. Well, you know it's not. So then I start to drill down. What's not going so good, right? They don't know what they need, but they do know how they're feeling. And
yes.
so you're working them through the impact. A bit like you go into a doctor's surgery. You don't walk in and ask for an appendectomy or something like that. You tell them you've got a pain. And they, through the questioning processes, start to work through where that pain is. But in this case, what you're doing is you're trying to co-create the solution with the client rather than just give them the solution as a doctor would. But it's exactly the same process. They feel the impact of whatever the problem is. So your questions have got to be around the impact, identifying the impact. When is it occurring? How often is it occurring? You know, very similar like that. So to me, they don't have to know the answer or know what they need or want. And in most cases, they probably won't. But that's why your conversation is so important.
Yeah, I agree totally. And thanks, Nick. Thanks for that question as well. So if you've got anything else, again, comments, thoughts, what you're doing, what you're hearing, what you're going to do next, which is the challenge for Jace, please throw anything into the chat or continue to ask questions, please, because that's really important. This is about providing all of you guys that are online the next layer of information to help you in this process.
Can I just jump in there, Paul? It's just in terms of the philosophy of keeping it simple, I think, and to Nick's question in the chat, selling or having that conversation about what the services are is really a conversation with the client about whether we can help. And that's what I think, that's what Warwick's saying, I think. And you have this conversation, and using our experience, which is what Glenn's doing, you can ask the right questions or walk down that path, but you're having a conversation to see whether you can help. It's that simple. Because the client's not going to know what they need ultimately until you do the drill down and you do the assessment.
Yeah,
I think
there's two phases of that, Eddie. I think step one is help the client identify what they need. And the second phase then is to identify whether you can help. To me,
that's right.
Yeah, to me, helping the client clarify what their needs are is so powerful, even if you can't help them. Whereas if you're sitting there and you start with, how can I help? You're always trying to frame their problem into your solution.
This is good from you, Cavell. This is good. Yeah, yeah. I finally understand what you're talking about. Well, that's taken me 2.5 shows or 1.5 shows. But that's actually quite valid there. Yeah.
Right. And what's important about that, Warwick, what's important about that is people buy your trust. And by having that conversation saying, well, it's not something I can help you with, but X, Y, Z, you're starting to develop that trust. The client will value that, and then you're in the value space.
Yeah. Well, I think that even helping the client, you know, getting back to Nick's comment, you know, the client doesn't know what they don't know, sort of thing. And so by helping them clarify, this is their problem, this is what that's really impacting them, that's a light bulb moment for many clients. And suddenly it simplifies. Okay, that's great. Then me now as the advisor have the choice. Do I want to help them? Can I help them? Will I help them? And that's the second part. But to me, don't put that What's the old expression that he has a hammer, sees the world as a nail. You're trying to force the client's problem into the solution that you have. As soon as you do that, you're in trouble. The first thing to me is help the client identify exactly what their problem is without any suggestion of you selling them or offering them anything. And then step two, once that's clear, step two is then work out how and when, or how you can help them or not.
I think, sorry, Peter.
Sorry, no, Jace, you go.
I think so far what I've heard is understand your client, develop some trust, stop trying to shove product or solutions down their throat, but really the needs analysis and diagnosing the problem. I'm going to come from so I want to come from okay, that's fantastic. Now, how do I fee it? Now, I mean, I hope I'm not jumping the gun, but we just, before we started, we all spoke about we've got a fair bit on. How do we convert those conversations into fees?
I might come back to that one though, Jace, though, because there's just one thing that I want to sort of just clarify with, sort of, again, just picking up a little bit of what we put down from the October show, and that was around Glen mentioned it's probably one major factor, or sort of one of the most key important aspects that you spoke about was listening. And this is probably where, again, can you just expand on that a little bit to how important that is to listen? And I know a lot of people think, and I'll take this back from all of my sales experience, but a lot of people think that selling is about talking, but actually it's the opposite. Selling is about listening.
Yeah, and a few points there that the client often doesn't know what they need, which we've sort of spoken about, but they know there is an issue, and our role becomes how do we help them express that. So you've got to listen, and listening has any number of subsets, one of which is not talking and not thinking about what you're going to say next. So actually really actively listening to what is it that they're saying, and then as you get, I guess, more experience, you start to pick up on, well, what aren't they saying? I've heard people talk about this before, and they would normally mention this as well, but they're not. So what's happening over here in the business or over here with the family, because they haven't mentioned that. Listening is also about body language, so are they leaning in, and are they engaged, or are they tuning out, and are they, I listen by watching people do this or frown on, and try and work out, well, how is the conversation going based on that. I listen a lot and get told a lot, particularly in the succession planning, family advisory side of things, by pausing and just having that uncomfortable silence, because what you find is people hate silence, Jason especially, but most people, if you pause for 5 seconds, they will fill that silence because they get a little bit uncomfortable. And that's when the real nuggets come out, and the real, what they're really wanting to say. If you have a conversation and stop for 5 seconds, it's a huge amount of time. It doesn't sound like much, but if I stop talking for 5 seconds, at some point my client will give me some more information. And so, and then I guess the other thing to all that listening is priming them so that they give you some good stuff to listen to, and therefore it's always open questions. Tell me more about that. How did that make you feel? Rather than, was that a good experience? Yes. Oh, okay. Well, I can't listen to much there. If I'm asking a closed question, I don't actually get much back. So they've got to be really open questions that encourage them to explore. And I'll often, and in the family work I do, I often tell them up front that I'm going to ask the same question, perhaps in slightly different ways. And that's not because I'm not listening. It's just that if I reframe a question, 10, 20 minutes later in the conversation, sometimes that will trigger something in them, and they'll answer it a slightly different way. So it sounds simple, listening, but it's a hugely important skill. And then it goes to all those things that we're talking about, which you will start to uncover what do they really need. And once you know what they need, you'll understand what they value. And if you're talking about something they value, you're not selling, you know, they're buying. That's the cliche, you know, they're just, and that's what I want.
The other aspect to that, Glenn, is I find that intent plays a big game in listening. If you're listening with the intent to solve the problem, it is different from listening with the intent to understand the problem. And because if you're there to solve the problem, you're always wanting to jump in. You're always, what your brain is doing is thinking of solution, whereas your intent is just simply to understand the problem. So I try and compartmentalize the process and say, step one, just listen with the intent to understand. That's it. Just understand. The problem solving can come later, but if you're trying to feed, you've got the intent of responding or problem solving in your head, it will impact your listening, and it will not be as effective as if you're listening with the intent to understand.
Yes. I describe myself, and it's probably a breach of the Mental Health Act or something, but I describe myself as an amateur psychiatrist or psychologist, in that all I'm really doing is sitting with business owners or family members and just listening to what they're saying, and then using my experience to put that in context and ask some clarifying questions, and trying to get that out. And I think it comes back to, Paul, you mentioned, you know, that cliche of trusted advisor. If you are listening and you're not trying to sell, they will see that you've actually got a good intention. You just want to understand the problem and see if you can help it. And if you can't help it, you'll know someone who can. And that buys you a lot of trust, and therefore they become more open. And then you understand what the problem is. You work out, can I solve it or not? And if I can't, who do I know who can?
Yeah, spot on. That's another key thing that, you know, again, picking up. One is open questions, which again may not come comfortable to some of our audience they're used to asking open style questions. So it's something again that we can learn from. And I think, Eddie, mate, what's your experience on that sort of level of people learning to ask those sorts of questions?
To ask those sort of questions?
Just the open style questions, you know, as opposed to closed questions. Is you're right. You don't want your yes and no, because then your conversation is shut down. But the open question leads to more information that you sit back and just listen to, which psychologists and psychiatrists are very good at doing.
Yeah. So that was if I could just say, that was a bit of a role play. So what I basically did was I followed the last 3 or 4 words of your statement and paused for milliseconds, and you went into and elaborated on open and closed questions. So now we're going to have a conversation. You actually understand what open and closed questions are. So you actually have part of the solution to the problem that we're having a conversation about. That's the first point I want to make. So really coming back to people repeating what they've said, not the whole sentence, but maybe parts of it, particularly the last parts of it. The second thing that I just did then was I practiced it. So I practiced listening. So they're the two takeaways there. And it's a simple environment here where I'm starting to practice about active listening, and it's picking up on Glenn points and Warwick's point. Usually I'm talking, I'm also thinking. Who you're talking to is thinking about what you're saying so they can prepare their response. So there's actually about 4 conversations happening in the room. By me repeating the last 3 or 4 words, what you just said, means I'm focusing on you. You're elaborating on that question you posed to me, and I'm drilling down on your response to that, getting deeper into your understanding. So I'm trying to build up some trust. That's what's going to sell.
Yeah, brilliant. And Jace, how'd you go with that, mate?
I was listening. Quite interesting. Sort of takes me back to a bit of marriage counselling, really. No need to listen to solve the problem, Jason. I just want you to fucking listen to me. I don't mind taking the piss.
Yeah, right. So that's good. That's good. Share, my friend. Share.
No. I guess something did hit home a little bit. I know that sometimes I'm listening with the intent of solving the problem. And sometimes that happens just as to the person that you are or how much time you've got at your disposal. And I think, one of the things that I learned early doors is that one of the most finite resources that we all have in common is our access to time. Right? It's a finite resource that we've all got. There's 24 hours in every day. There's 7 days in a week. It's 365 in a year. And it's just, But when you give somebody your time, that person typically knows how finite that resource is, they really see value in that, and they really see that you do care. And I think that's a big takeaway for me. So I did that, and then I just did just relate a little bit about the whole conversations we have. I know that Frosty refers to himself as an amateur psychologist. I do too. I've spent a lot of time with them, so I've learned their secrets of the trade. But and that pause piece is a good piece. I do it on stage as well. I've done it on radio. On stage or on radio, it's quite frightening to pause, but it's so powerful. Yeah.
You can't pause for too long on radio because I'll fill it with an ad.
Yeah.
And it's a good one because I'm pretty sure you've got some team members online listening and watching this right now. So we might even challenge some of them to chime into the chat to say how good's Jason at listening. I won't mention anyone's name, but if you want to jump on board, that's good. Let's go back to your earlier one, talking about pricing then, because again, it is a difficult one where probably the industry has been into this, how we look at this. Is it a average hourly rate? Is it an hourly rate type of charge? Is it on? So what's your thoughts on that, guys? Not quite sure who would like to kick off there. What's your thoughts on how we actually look at it, pricing this, where the value is displayed, and we might even go back a step as well. And I've got a question for you, but let's talk about pricing first of all.
I think it's important to put it in the context, right? If I can just frame it. So with respect, Frosty working at PwC, that brand, the customer is more used to experiencing an advisory type offering, and comparing that to businesses that are, just starting off and trying to introduce it. I think that we need to make sure that the frame's right there. But yeah, I just wanted to frame that up because not everyone on the call is working at.
But the same principles apply in that it comes back to benefit versus cost. And what I spend a lot of time with my team is that our clients see our cost and they can understand it. They see a quote. It's going to cost you 20 grand for this piece of advice. We're not so good at articulating it is what's the benefit they're going to get from that, because you can't work out value unless you've got cost and benefit, and value is just the difference between the two in my mind. Is it going to cost me what I'm going to get? That is actually really hard to articulate depending on what you're doing, but some things it's much easier than others. So if I'm doing tax advisory work, so a client has come there, it's an existing client, we're doing their year-end work, and they've got a Division 7A, hopefully it won't get too technical, like too taxes. They've got a Division 7A problem. We can either just go and run around and do a whole bunch of work as part of the year-end accounts and just, bundle that up. Or we can sit down with them and say, look, here is the issue. We think that we can restructure this, and this is the benefit that you will get from that. And then I try and break it down, and I don't try and make it percentages, 47% of this versus 30% of that, or I try and actually break it down to dollars and say, if we restructure your Division 7A loans and put them on a sub-trust or however we go about doing it, we know that on average, we can save you 60 grand per million of loan over the lifetime of that loan, or whatever so that they can tangibly start to think, okay, I've got $1 million problem. You reckon you can save me 60 grand over the life of this loan. If you're billing me 10 grand, that's about.
I'm 50 grand ahead.
Get me an investment that will deliver that. If I just say to them, we're going to do a Division 7A review and it's going to cost you 20 grand, they've got no way of, they know it's going to cost them 20 grand and they go, ouch, what am I getting for that? So we've got to go that extra step and articulate the benefit that they're getting. And once we've done that, the value equation works.
Yeah. I think as you said, Frosty, it's a lot easier to quantify the value from a tax consulting, tax advisory perspective. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I it's funny when you started off the conversation around the customer or the client always knows our fees, because typically what we do when we take over a file, we pick up the income statement, and when we look at expenses, the first expense is accounting, and some of those more creative firms, if you go down, it's in professional fees, which is, some of those firms that do that. I don't know, but so they're sort of hiding the cost down there. But I think it is a lot easier to quantify in that perspective, and I think
Jason,
the framing of the language. Sorry, Mr. Cavell, haven't you?
I agree with what you've just said, but the question I'd ask you is, why do you think it's much easier to quantify the tax benefits than it is the business advisory benefits?
Yep. So that's I need to be careful. That's not a loaded question, just based on what Ted Lasso said earlier. I guess firstly, I think see, look at me, Jen. So I'm listening. I'm a big boy. No, I think
good job.
I think
You should have paused first.
Look, now I'm pausing.
There you go.
I think the first thing is that it's the sphere that we're most comfortable in, and we understand accounting and tax, and that's the sphere that we're comfortable in, and we've got a training in it. I think that would be the first reason. And I think the second reason is that to articulate the value and calculate the value, it's less ambiguous because, 30% of X versus 47% of X, that's a number. It's straightforward. Yeah.
In the second one, in the business advisory, where does the value lie?
Well, I would have thought that the value lies in the eye of the beholder, Mr. Cavell.
Exactly.
There you go.
In the second one, the value lies in the client's head.
Yeah.
Whereas in the first one, the value is objectively ascertained. And so the accountant can actually calculate that very easily. But in the first one, the business advisory, it's in the client's head. And that's why the conversation is so important here, because you've got to get the client to articulate their own value. In the compliance accounting, you don't need to do that. So to me, if we're talking about a strategic plan or something like that, and again, I don't like to talk about services, but if we said, our business is just not on the one page, okay, let's get it onto the one page. If it were on the one page, what difference would it make to your business? Oh, okay. Now I'm starting to extract from the client. Okay, what would that look like? What would be happening that's different today? How would that impact your business, do you think? Now the client's now slowly starting to quantify in their head the impact. Now, the trouble is that I've got to do that because if I see it as the advisor as $1 million impact, the client only sees it as a $100,000 impact, we're going to have a bit of a problem when we come to pricing, right? So one of the things I've got to extract from them is what would be happening? How would the world be different for you, Mr. or Mrs. Client, if we were all on the one page? Yeah. And then work through and quantify that so the client feels that, oh, gee, this is. I was thinking this is going to be a $50,000 impact on it, but I think it's going to be $1 million. Oh, it's going to be huge. Now we're starting to talk about the real benefits of doing this. Now we're in the realistic zone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there? And I think the proposition, and Warwick's spot on there, the proposition that Glen put on the table in relation to tax, I think that service is undersold. And if I just explain just very quickly with a bit of basic economics, you're in the marketplace, you're delivering a service that has a particular level of value, and the client's willingness to pay is set up here somewhere. You price it somewhere, which you think is where the market is. There's that gap, right? And then you've got resource cost to deliver that. You've got rent, you've got training, education, power, IT. Okay, so you've created all this value. Some of it goes to you. Some of it goes as profit, but then the client retains some. Now, where is that willingness to pay is what Warwick's talking about, having that conversation. Okay, so Glen, we save you $100,000 in tax. What does that mean? Well, I can now invest that in the business to get some growth. What does that mean for you? I can get extra turnover, more profit. I can take that profit and make it into an investment over here. But what's that mean for you? All of a sudden, we're turning $50,000 into $5 million. You're leaving, there's a huge willingness to pay above the price you've pitched. And the only way you're going to understand that difference is by having that conversation with the client. And what your job is to lift that price point so you're capturing more value away from the client because you understand that. You still leave them a bit because otherwise they're not going to buy. What we do as accountants is we look at the cost base and we say, yes, I'll outsource this to Vietnam and it's going to be lower costs to do the books. I might buy some robots, that's going to lower my costs. So I'm capturing more value by reducing costs rather than having that value conversation, understanding what it means to the client, capturing that value, that's direct bottom line stuff.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And I think there was a lot of, even the stuff that I wrote down, and it's a funny thing. One of the things that resonated with me was probably, again, 20 years ago, I got taught this, what's the benefit of the benefit? And that's exactly what you were just working through then, Ted, in terms of just sharing that, what would you do with that, and what would be the benefit of that? So think about that in terms of to all of our listeners, just in terms of the benefit of the benefit, because there's the knock-on effect will be 2, 3, 4 times.
Right. And so you might get to a point where the client says, well, I want to do that because I want to increase the value of the business because I want to sell it in 5 years' time. Well, there is like half a dozen service offerings right there on the table.
Yeah.
And you're building trust over this 5-year period, and that client's not going anywhere because they trust you, they understand you, you understand the value now, so you can start pitching. So, okay, so that's worth it's $1 million impact. So do you think a $50,000 investment with my time to help you with that is unreasonable? And I think the answer will be, well, no. I'm spending 50 grand to get $1 million.
Correct.
Yeah, the other side of the equation, Paul, too, is that, that Glenn was talking about, value equals benefits minus cost, is the other side is the cost side. And cost is a perception, right? It's a reality, but it's also a perception. And you can alter the client's perception of cost. And I forget what's his name, Beaton used to talk about this, with the idea of cost consciousness. And one of the ways you can do that is what I was taught at quite a young age, was you never give the client one single quote. So if it's an if you give them 2 or 3 different price points, right? So we could do it under point A, it would cost X amount of dollars. If we did it B, it cost Y. If we did it C, it would cost Z. Not too many, because then it becomes confusing. But 2 or 3 different price points. What that's demonstrating unconsciously to the client is that you're interested in and thinking about them from a cost perspective. And it also means that when they come back to you and say, oh, but someone else can do it at a cheaper price. Well, we've got a cheaper price in there, but the cheaper price requires you to do more of the work. So what tends to happen is, instead of them comparing your price with someone else, they're comparing your 3 prices, if that makes sense. Yeah. So the idea is that you've got them focused on you, and you're also sort of developing this concept of cost consciousness. We are conscious of we're trying to spend your money as if it was for our own. And so we're going to give you 3 prices or 2 prices, and that can cut off a lot of disputes later in the thing. So cost consciousness can also impact the equation as well.
Can I jump on the back of that, Cavell Avenue? It's a little trick, sales 101, that I learned from Rob Nixon. And he spoke about small, medium and large, and typically what you're looking at doing, in a similar vein than what Warwick spoke about, was that you could have service level number 1, where you get A, B and C, service level number 2, where you get A, B and C, but you also get D and E, and service level number 3 is A, B, C, D and E, plus you get F and G, right? Not F and G, F and G. And what he said was that your sweet spot, and I understand and I respect everybody's position around serving the customer. I get all that. But your sweet spot is the medium, is the middle, right? And so what you're trying to do is you go, for number 1, it's 5 grand. For number 2, it's 9,500. And for number 3, it's 30 grand, right? And so what you're doing is you're saying you want them to go to B, where you get the 9.5 grand. Every now and then some idiot will pay you 30 grand, so you take it off them. But really what you're trying to do is you put, because it's like, it's a buyer behavior, right? So people go and they go, oh, do you want the large fries? No, I'm not a fat bastard. I'll just take the medium one, right? It's like, everyone just wants to be like the next person. And so I learned that early doors, and I think it's not a bad little, I was going to say trick, but Warwick will sort of jump down my throat and tell them I'm not listening to the customer and I'm just always trying to, no, I'm just playing with you. But you understand?
Number 1, you do listen at conferences, which is important. Number two,
Yeah.
it's not usually your, but number two, you're 100%. It's the psychology of buying, and you know, people don't want to be the cheap guy. People don't want to be the more expensive guy. They go, oh yeah, the middle one, and all the research will show you that people will go to the middle one.
Except you get someone with an ego that wants to give you 30 grand, mate. I'll take it off you.
Correct.
Correct, debit. Sign this form. Yeah.
The other practical example of that, and again, I sort of, in terms of ease of selling advisory services, there's no doubt, you know, tax advisory is easier than business advisory, and then there's family advisory, I think. So, but breaking it down from a tax perspective for the audience, I will often sort of say to a client, look, for us to do this advice, it's going to cost, you know, 15 grand. If you want us to cover off, you know, the non-residency and the control foreign company provisions, then that's probably 25. And if you want a ruling, that's 50. And so they get to choose, but all of a sudden the 15 or 20 grand reference to 50 grand doesn't sound that expensive.
Yeah.
So you're giving them the choice, and then it depends on how much certainty they want. And all of a sudden, 25 grand, which sounded expensive when you first pitched it, is half the cost of.
Yeah, that's good from you, Frosty.
And the point you raised there, Glenn, I think is really important, is that you're giving them choice. The brain is hardwired. You know, see what happens when you have compulsory vaccinations. But you know, if you don't give people choice, you will get resistance. And I see this in accounting practices all the time. You know, the accounting books will come in, they'll do the compliance work, and then all of a sudden there's bits that haven't been done by the client that should have been. They're outside scope. And instead of going back to the client and asking them, do you want us to do it or not? The accounting practice goes ahead and does it. You're depriving the client of choice, because they didn't have that. You're in real hot water if you do that. But the other thing I just want to raise that makes, I think, that the business advisory services harder to price is that if you know, when you're solving a tax problem, you're solving a technical problem. I know the starting point, I know the work I have to do, and I know the outcome that I'm going to get. So I could bundle that up and say, that's going to cost me 20 grand. But if I talk about getting the business onto the one page and everybody working together, how many variables are there in that, right? It's not that I start at point one, because what I do at step one may affect what happens at step two, which impacts what happens at step three, if you know what I mean. In a technical problem, it's not so much, it can be, but it's not so much a risk. But if we do a strategic planning workshop, for example, and we find that there's a whole lot of stuff that comes out, family issues that we didn't know were there, well, we might have to head off on a completely different path. Does that make sense? So it's not A, B, C, D with business advisory. So to get around that, what I always do is just to chunk. So we might have this goal of going this whole long distance, but I only know that let's just focus on chunk one and see what comes out of that. And I know how much work I've got to put into that. And I know, and we can work out how much value that is to the client. Then let's reassess it. But in the back of my mind, I've got this $100,000 deal or whatever it is, the full picture, but I can't price that. I can only price the first chunk.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Which is,
to me, that's clever. Very clever. Guys, let's, and look, it's a funny one. Peter Moggs just sort of beat me to it with his question there as well. So it's an important one, because
absolutely.
Let's get into some of the team member stuff and how we start talking to team members about this. And the question is, very experienced practitioners usually get the advisory piece and do it okay. Our issue is leveraging on the experience and getting the younger staff to acquire these skills. How's this done? Who wants to talk about, again, how we start talking to team members about this?
For me, it's and yeah, I have this issue, exact same issue. You know, how do I get more staff involved? And it sounds obvious, but we just don't do it very well. Bringing them along to the meetings and prepping them beforehand. Like I imagine there's lots of meetings, and for me personally, I used to go to lots of meetings by myself because I would come back and brief the team, but I'm sort of cutting them out. So making sure you're bringing your team members with you to those meetings. It's not that cost effective to have, 2 or 3 people in the room, but you don't have to bill all that time. It's training time. And then investing in their development. You know, how many of your team members, there's a session today on mastering advisory. How many team members were brought along to listen to that, and how are you going to expose them to different points of view? How are they going to learn unless you expose them to the theory and the practice?
It's a very good point. So I suppose, as Glenn was just saying then, to all you guys that are online live, I don't know how many team members are with you in this particular session. So it is being recorded. It is on our Professional Partners show channel as well. So if you ever want to show this content to team members, use it. That's what this is about, making sure that we can share as much information, but you can use it to your advantage as well. And this is all free content. You guys haven't paid for any of this. So use it to your advantage and share this with your team members. Guys, how do you go about? I know a number of the firms that I've spoken to about this as well.
Paul,
they don't know how to.
Paul, can I just go back? I'd like to answer that question that build on to what Glenn just said, because I think there are other ways to do that. Because the risk is that sometimes that people feel, I don't want to expose my junior staff to situations with clients. So one of the things that I would really strongly suggest, and as I sent you some notes on it, Paul, but you know, I, for the last 15 years, I've been working with the ACA training group, and so we're working with supervisors and getting them to have the conversation. One of the places that I would start would be internally within the practice. The conversations of a trusted advisor are not too different from a business leader. So let's start incorporating that, so that the models of conversation that I use with my clients are the same models of conversation that can be used internally. So we start using the same conversations internally. So, for example, at staff reviews, right? So we start talking about this to the staff member. We start getting the staff member to do their own one-page plan for their next 12 months, right? And in that one-page plan, we ask some questions like, where do you want to be? Where are you now? What are the sorts of challenges that you're going to have to face to get there? And it becomes this conversation internally with staff members, so they get used to that sort of conversational style, because that conversational style is exactly what you're going to be doing with clients. So, you know, you embed it in the organization, so it becomes just a natural conversational style. So I'd be really strongly recommending, it's not just about going to training courses, because we know what happens at training courses. Half an hour after the training course is over, we're going, well, what training course? Did I attend one? Did I? You know, it doesn't exist anymore. So it's got to be embedded in the organisation. So I encourage organisations to actually start those conversations internally and practice them. Networking events, right? There's no cost, there's no risk there. So how do let's start doing some networking stuff and practicing those conversations. And so there's a number of different ways that we can develop those skills.
That was the point I was making when I set up that loaded question, was, you know, let's just practice that. And I remember back in the Arthur Anderson days, when you reached a certain level, you would be put under pressure. You would say, for instance, sell to a client, you'd be in a room with other people, your equivalent, they'd videotape you. You'd have assessment of that videotape by all your peers, you'd be given some tips, and then by the end of the day, you'd have to do it again, and the amount of improvement was out of sight. I mean, I'd be having a lot of fun with this. If I was the leader of the team, I'd be putting out the brief to the staff saying, you're in these 3 or 4 separate teams, here's a brief, come back, present your solutions. How would you approach this? How would you talk to me as the client? You know, have some fun with that. But having that culture embedded in the business, I think is what Warwick's saying, is, and there's many ways of doing it, but that's what I'd be doing.
I think my biggest takeaway, PJ, was a change of mindset. You know, Frosty spoke about, it's a really valid point, bringing team members along the journey. I mean, they're only going to get experience by actually experiencing it. For us, the best way we've found with, you know, team member training or staff training or PD is on the job training. And I think it's that mentality of, you know, you've got KPIs or KRAs in your business that talk about productivity. You need to just lessen them a little bit for the, you know, your key team members that you want to bring on the journey as part of their progression path. Come along, Celeste, come along, Joe Blow, Harry, whatever. Be a part of it. You know, it's not all going to be chargeable time, but they're learning. And the more they do, the more they learn. And, you know, we started this conversation off by saying that our customers or our clients are after our experience, not our opinion. if our guys aren't getting the experience, they're never going to get the freaking experience. So I think it's a real change in mindset that I've taken away anyway.
Magnificent. Now, guys, we're just going to quickly go over time here, so hopefully everyone's okay with this. I just want to, some of the firms that I've spoken to, certainly as a part of the feedback as well, is that they, to start the conversation, let's say that you've actually spoken about Warwick, that's the bit they have trouble with. So how do they price that? So how do they approach the client, and how do you price that? Because, you know, the experience from most of the firms say, well, my client doesn't actually want me to come in and have a chat to them because they know that they're going to get charged for that. So how do you make sure that, again, have that conversation up front? What's your experience there about what we do there so that the door is open and not closed?
I mean, to me, the answer to that is just so simple. You're already having client meetings. You should not be going in there on the pretext that, oh, I've got something to sell you, right? I want to have a conversation. You're sitting there doing their annual compliance work. That's the entree into business advisory. To me, that's why I'm not that interested in setting up a separate business advisory division, because I think all client-facing staff should have these conversational skills. It's not something that belongs in a division. It's something that should be a natural tendency for all client-facing staff. Otherwise, you're going to miss opportunities. So to me, I've got a set of accounts in front of me. The client needs to sign them off. What do I do? How do I start that conversation? It's not, the client's not expecting me to come in and sell something. I'm not putting pressure on myself. I've got these financials. So I'm sitting there going, oh, look, I noticed you've had 3 or 4 good years over the last few years, and you've got, had good profitability. But I noticed you haven't built a great deal of wealth, right? I'm just sowing the seed. So I'm now throwing out some lines to them. And so it's not about going in there with something to sell. It's about observing their accounts, looking at what's going on there, or, how's your business going? It's just a general conversation that starts off.
But if those sets of accounts are just being emailed to clients to sign off on, which I know happens quite a lot as well, and Jason, is probably a good one for you at the practice. So how much of that conversation have the opportunity, as opposed to robotic, behind the times, deadlines, bang, we've got to get it out. We just got to get the client to approve it and we've got to lodge it.
Well, my takeaway is don't email. Get any opportunity to have a conversation with the customer, you take that opportunity. And where I find the challenge, Warwick, where the challenge is typically the nature of the accountant is not versed or skilled with the communication skills. And I think the big takeaway is typically the partner or the principals or the associate directors or whatever they do, and it comes down to the training process. And as has been highlighted today from not just Ted Lasso, but the other members of our panel, what's been highlighted today is not so much having all the answers, but it's asking the questions. And most of us have the ability to ask questions.
It's being interested in the client's business. That's where it starts. I've got a set of compliance financials in front of me. I'm genuinely interested in the client's business. Now, that's where my questions start to come from. Now, answering Paul's, I agree with you, Jason, that you may not want to meet with every client because some of them are so small and stuff like that. But you sort of say, well, you're in a relationship business. What sort of relationship are you building if you're just sending stuff out by email all the time? And give it another half an hour and AI will replace you anyway. So why, if that's the way you're going, that's not the future of accounting, I wouldn't have thought. You'll be replaced very quickly. So to me, but even if you are emailing them out, you might email them out and then put covering an email with them and say, look, I wouldn't mind having a chat to you over the phone or Zoom or whatever about your account. So you just have a talk them through half an hour. But in that half an hour, you get a chance to ask some just general questions that give you an open door to step in and find out what they're really thinking and what's hurting them,
What to make this, I think I made this point last discussion, is it's got to be a choice. You've got to make this choice that you're in this value space and you're there to help clients. It's just not punching out the accounts and sending them an email. I mean, how many times do you go get a blood test and your doctor says, oh, you come in and let's have a chat about your results. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. And so your results are good. Thanks for coming in. There's some lessons in that. I think you've got to get in front of clients and you've got to see whether you can help them.
So Anthony's just asked a good question. What about for new clients? So he's just asked a question: how do you approach a new client with advisory?
I would say a new client is easier.
Yeah, me
simply
too.
Because you've got permission to ask whatever question you like.
Mm.
One of the dangers with an existing client is that you sort of feel like you should know the answer. So sometimes you don't ask the question because you feel like, oh, I've known for 5 years. I feel like a bit of a goose if I ask you now. So with a new client, you just ask away. You know, they've come to you for a reason normally. So something has happened. So that's a starting point. But then you've got the ability to ask any question at all. You know, where do you want to be in 10 years' time? You know, talk to me about that. And then they start going, oh, you know, I want to do this. And you're right, you're probably going to need some funding. You know, let's talk about that. You know, it's new ones are generally easier.
It's no difference, I don't think. You're still having a conversation to see whether you can help. And if you can't, this is what I can do for you. This is who I can introduce you to. It's still a conversation about where you can help.
I agree with both comments. I think that Glenn, a lot of accountants experience it being harder with existing clients also because they feel in themselves that if you start asking questions different than what you have over the last 5 years, the client's going to say, well, why didn't you ask me that question 5 years ago? Why weren't you offering this service 3 years ago? And the truth of the matter is the client is so delighted to have you asking the questions now, they don't even think about what you didn't do 5 years ago. It's only in our heads that we worry about those sorts of things. But I agree with Glenn. It does, the perception is that it's easier because you've got an open slather. You can just, but I agree with Eddie too, that it's still a conversation. It's still the same sort of conversation. It's not more complex than that. You know.
Well said, gentlemen, and thank you. Any parting comments from anybody? We've just gone 1:37, so
just make a parting comment about value, and which I didn't finish off on my conversation about willingness to pay. It's different for everyone. Some people will buy a Timex, some people will buy a Rolex. You're in that conversation, you want to find out where that willingness to pay is. Am I talking to a Rolex guy that we can really add some value here and therefore capture some of that? So everyone's different. So just don't price or value something at a particular point because, you know, that person you're talking to may value that very differently.
Very true. Very true. Well said. Warwick, any parting comments?
No, I think it's been well said, and I think I've said enough.
I like that you got your
I've taken over Jason's role.
You know, again, at least he labelled you today, so none like last time. You were sort of probably feeling a little bit left out. So Cavell Avenue was nice. Yeah,
you've done some of your best work in Cavell Avenue, Jenso. So
I just got through, Jason.
Anything for you, Frosty, to close off with, mate?
Just to reflect on how much your clients actually value what you've got to say. I think we understate how much they look to us and how much they value what have we learned from other businesses like theirs.
Yep. Well said. Jace?
Nothing further to add, Mr. Jance. I'm good.
Beautiful. Well, to all of you guys that have joined us and supported us throughout 2021, thank you. Again, we started this in 2020. It's our second year. It's been absolutely wonderful to be able to bring you guys something maybe a little bit different. And I know that we've had a lot of different firms over the years. So thanks for supporting us. To Glenn, to Warwick, to Eddie, thank you for joining us today. Special mention to my friend Jason Cunningham, who's always got opinions, always got thoughts, but you know, again, you can just tell by the passion that he has, and that's what this is all about. So whether we're sharing information and we've got really strong opinions on things, it's because we're passionate about it. So I just wanted to say thanks to you as well, Jace. It's been a great year, and we're here to help the industry and make this industry great.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm very passionate about the industry, as you know, PJ, and you know, if I can do anything to help another practitioner, I will do that. I'm not the kind of bloke that runs around pinching staff from people. That's sort of not my go. But Frosty, I mean, that's the space he floats in. I don't mind that. It's, you know, gloves are off. Anyway, good on you, PJ. Frosty, thanks for your time. Cavell Avenue and Ted Lasso, you're outstanding. All the best to your families. We'll see you again next year, Jenso.
Thank you all.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in 2022. Have a great Christmas.
See you guys.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.